transcription. Okay, Christine.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is an input workshop. I sent out documents to the VCUDA Association. There may be others on this call. I'm noticing that maybe did not get this presentation. I sent it out about 45 minutes ago. Maybe you could post for those.
The presentation, yeah, I'll pull up the.
Yep.
It's not posted online, so I can't really do a link. But
okay.
We'll be going through it on the line.
All right, so we're going to talk. The goal of this meeting is to really get input on what we're proposing for design standards. We are not locked into any of these, but let me kind of pre-position why we're doing this. It certainly was a topic in the legislature and part of Act 71 that the state do a statewide design. Now, you know, our board originally, the Vermont Community Broadband Board, had a desire to do a statewide design. The concern that we presented to the board was that if we do that, we're going to end up adding about 5 months to the schedule before we can release the construction funds. And that, you know, really put the next year's construction season at risk. So we got an agreement that we can do design standards. And some of these design standards are also to address some of the concerns that were expressed both at the legislature as well as in the telecommunications plan regarding, you know, capacity for things like mobile wireless and public safety. So we want to make sure we include that as part of the grant requirements. So in other words, showing a design that has these in there. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go through one bullet at a time. And we'll, can you pull up that presentation?
Yeah, I'm going to try. For some reason, our video here is not working, so let's hope the presentation works. If not, we may have to reset.
I assume everybody can hear us. So
Yes.
If you can hear us, raise your hand.
Okay, good.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, and can you see the presentation?
Yes.
All right,
Yes,
excellent. So go to the meeting protocol. So as you say, each design rule will be presented and discussed, including the rationale. The rules are proposed and draft. CODs, towns not part of the Cs, telecom, construction, anybody on this call can provide input. So anyway, let's go to the, well, first, any questions about meeting protocol?
Let's see if we have questions. I'm going to unmute Leslie Nolte has a question. So I'm going to spotlight her. And if you could unmute yourself, Leslie. You can unmute yourself, Leslie, if you have a question. Okay, I'm going to assume that you don't have a question. Chris Recchia has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So the question is, do you want us to provide input on each of these as we go through, or do you want us to wait to the end in terms of meeting protocol? How do you want to do this?
No, I'd like to do it with each major bullet.
Okay.
And I know this is going to take time, but I think it's, you know, if we have to have another session, we'll do that as well. Because I don't know if any of you have been through standards discussion before. Certainly I have, even at the national level. And if you don't take the time up front, you end up with problems in the long run.
Okay, sounds fine. Thank you.
And each one of these, I'll kind of suggest that we really got, we really got to decide which of these are required or which one of these are recommended and which one of these are optional. So let's hit the first bullet on network design, and that's a great one to start with.
We do actually have more questions.
Okay.
So next up with David Jones, let me spotlight you and then you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning. I would like to know, first of all, what is the intended scope of a statewide design? And secondly, are these proposed standards strictly for the purpose of informing a statewide design?
No, these are, so first of all, the reason there was a statewide design discussed and proposed and actually put into the legislation as the option was to ensure that we meet all the goals of first of all, the Vermont Telecommunications Plan and the goals set up forth in Act 71. So certainly there are concerns about, are we providing enough adequate spare fiber to meet we're building a 40-year network. Are we adding enough spare fiber in order to meet the demographic changes that could occur in Vermont over the next 40 years? Are we building enough fiber to include mobile wireless? Are we including enough fiber to address public safety concerns? And are we doing things in a way that provide high quality networks yet trying to achieve the goal of getting every Vermonter connected?
Okay, Christine, I think there's 2 points being discussed here. One is the overall architecture of the network. And the second is the capacity that is built into the network initially, recognizing that capacity can be increased at any time. Is our focus on the architecture of the overall architecture of the networks in our state?
It's the architecture and the capacity.
Because, okay, I guess we'll get into these questions later, but our ability to anticipate the capacity requirements over some future period of time and to anticipate them all would appear to be limited. And we're going to have a question of economics, how much do we invest in the network versus the amount of revenue we obtain from the network? So I hope that we'll be getting into those economic discussions as we move through the program, and I'll stop there.
Yep, thank you. You've raised 2 important issues.
Carol Monroe, did you have a question? You had your hand up initially. Unmute yourself if you did.
A similar question to David. I just wanted to understand what the overall objectives and goals are of setting specific standards, some of which seem to be very detailed.
Did I answer that question for you, Carol, or would you? If I did not, please ask some more specific questions.
I think that we'll probably get into it as we go down through these criteria.
Okay.
That appears to be all the initial questions. So I'll turn it back to Christine, and we apologize that our video is not working over here.
Okay. So the first one, is basically we're looking at, for rural networks, passive optical networks. That doesn't necessarily exclude active networks. But when we talk about, let's first address the top level bullet, and we want to talk about, distributed splitters, or are we going to, is the focus going to be on, splitters at the home office, dedicated, I'm not sure we should care at the state level whether what we're doing with splitters, but we do care that we have a dedicated port for each address. So ultimately, if you're going to do splitters at the central office, then the question becomes, are you going to run a home run fiber for every address? Because ultimately the goal of this network is to allow every Vermonter to get connected to fiber optic networks. So that's the question on this one. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
You can just unmute yourself and go for it, but please try to keep your comments brief.
So this is Carol Monroe. On these three items, whether it's distributed splitters in the field, distributed splitters on the strand, or even in a central cabinet, I think is irrelevant to the goals in which you've established. All of that is very much into the details of how the network is built, but doesn't really affect any one of the goals that you've established. A dedicated port for every address, as long as the network is scalable, where you can add additional addresses as people sign up, and even include some percentage of overage in case we have a great boom of construction in Vermont. I think all of that is also can be done over time. If you do a dedicated port for every address, and yet you only get a 50% take rate, it's an incredible expense up front, and when it can be added over time, as long as you have accounted for every address in your design. And then
how would you add, suppose you're planning a 50% take rate and you find out you got 100%. Carol, maybe you can explain how would you go about adding?
Well, you run enough fiber and plan for enough ports for 100%, 110 or 120, but you in fact add that on the OLT side, you add that as you need it instead of 110 or 120% up front when you first build the network. In other words, some of this is scalable, and so to do it over time versus doing it up front is really going to be a monetary type of issue, and others can chime in. Maybe I don't have that quite right. I think we're not talking about an Active E network with an end-run fiber from central office to the home for every location. That isn't what we're planning for, and so I'm not sure where that stands. Including enough additional fibers in the design for mobile wireless or public safety or high volume business or cell towers, something along those lines is certainly what I think most of the CUDs are doing to allow for that future growth. But anybody else have comments on that's?
Yeah, before we go, so would you say, you say plan for enough ports? Should I rephrase that dedicated port to plan for enough ports, or is a dedicated port what I'm trying to say here?
I think you want to plan for 100+% universal access.
Okay, thank you.
But this is David, reinforcing Carol's point. That doesn't mean that you are going to include all of those ports in your initial build.
Well, if you're running a splitter to a residential area, how do you do that if you don't include it? How do you add ports? Are you talking about, if you're taking a 32 split and you're using, let me just throw out the numbers. If you're planning if you're doing a 32 split and you're planning on 50% penetration, and you're kind of at the end of a fiber and you don't have enough light, what do? You can't really add another splitter, right?
Christine, first of all, I would like to say that the number of people on this call who have any engineering knowledge that would be helpful in this discussion can probably be counted on the fingers of one hand, and I'm not one of them. So trying to get an answer to a question like that from this group is a non-starter. Moreover, Those of us who are in the process of engaging our selected partner are not yet at the position where we can bring an engineering resource into the room in order to talk productively on the subject. But I think that we can say that we all are aware of the need to plan long term and to make our architecture scalable. But that does not mean that we're going to build it all up front, because that would be cost prohibitive, and we need to watch our dollars because we need to be financially sustainable. So I don't think that any choice can be made in this room on this point.
All right, so
thank-
can I hear?
Yeah, thank you,
let's-
David. Can we hear from other people?
Yeah, let's hear from other people. Yeah.
Unmute yourself and speak up, and please just identify yourself.
Hi, this is Zach from Matrix Design Group. To provide a little bit more engineering perspective on the scalability, to second Carol's comments, the network itself can have capacity from a splitter level of servicing 100% or more of the community, of the residents, or potential future expansion. But if I could verbalize a picture in everyone's minds about what that expandability would look like, when you have your transmission fiber going from your active OLT out to field cabinets, if that cabinet is rated to service 144 customers and it were designed for a future state to hold 120, if you have a 50% take rate at day one, that cabinet would be filled halfway with splitters, meaning you don't necessarily need to utilize one OLT port from your head end, a trunk port out to that cabinet, hit the splitter, and distribute out to that customer to hit your 50% capacity rating on that particular cabinet. And as you procure more customers, you would be able to cut them in and add that splitter, because the customer is agnostic to which splitter port it is ever on, as long as it has its connection back to the OLT. So as a broad recommendation, whatever you're going to specify for your fiber capacity rating, you would be wise to err on the side of 100% penetration or 100% capability on the fiber, and then you stack on top of that any of those future, those high conviction future allocations you may need. You mentioned wireless, you mentioned security, and for those, you can't blanket that and say down every dead end road you need to have 12 fibers, 24 fibers spare for future. But looking at those main trunk routes, or if DOT has areas in mind to try to get a statewide layout of what they're looking for, so then that could just be incorporated into that overall plan. So there'd be, for example, 12 fibers reserved for DOT cameras or wrong way traffic cameras or smart signs or whatnot. And if from a carrier perspective, if there's a dark fiber requirement from the state to meet for that 40 or 50 year plan, that ultra long range plan, that go into that and just be a monetary, an economic item for those critical path areas, those river crossings, those environmental areas where you need different permits, where it's not as easy as just adding something in the future. But that cabinet can be spec'd out to have enough capacity to connect back to the OLT for 100%, 120%, but then you would just row into that port for every customer on an as needed basis, because they're chassis mounted. You can just rack and stack as many as the cabinet is able to support.
Yep, that's good. Thank you. That certainly works for me. Yeah, thank you. That's good. Any thoughts on that proposal?
What's the specific proposal again?
The proposal was that you make sure that you've got enough capacity on your fiber to the field cabinet so that you can add ports and splitters as necessary. So you want to meet 100% of your address needs with that distributed field cabinet and the light coming down that fiber. You don't want to have enough light to split, in other words. So, maybe it's 120% of the addresses. Certainly, we don't need to dedicate a port for address. I agree with that.
The only comment that I would put in there from a technical perspective as well, this is Mike Lucy, is having a clear understanding of what you think you need to design for is really going to drive, I think, a lot of this. To both Carol's and Zach's points, the splitter and laser development and research that's going on right now is just continuing to improve the utilization of existing fiber over time. So what I think out of the box, the state has a pretty clear idea of what the capacity need is, at least for the next 5 years, right? So it's building in that number, which also goes to David's point about being economical up front, knowing that your laser technology, your splitter technology over time is going to improve, which automatically improves your capacity ability in the future. But having some idea of how much additional capacity you want is going to be extremely helpful.
Right.
Whether it be 120%, 20% growth, whatever you think, different areas may dictate, different ideas, but or numbers.
Yeah, that's good, Mike. I agree with you. Your point's well taken. So some areas, in fact, is it safe to say if you plan for 100% take rate today and 100% of the addresses for generally rural areas of Vermont, that's probably going to work for the next 5 years. And then, but then specifically a recommendation as part of the design is make sure you add capacity for higher density areas. That's a recommendation. We certainly aren't going to get into that level of detail because that's only something the CUDs are going to know, from a ground truth standpoint. Does that sound right, Mike?
Yes, Christine. Yes.
Okay, good. Any
Christine,
other thoughts?
Jason?
I would also change the wording of, although most CUDs are doing a pond network of some sort, I don't think we should rule out an active E network. And so I think that should be an option. I mean, it's not something that we're planning on today, but there might be areas, particularly active E and high business density areas, might be something that we want to consider in the future, and we shouldn't rule that out as our network design element.
Yeah,
I'm not sure we should be so specific about the passive or active E.
No, I don't think so either. This is really, and I'll reword this to say, here are some recommendations regarding the passive optical network, but that doesn't limit you to it.
Yeah, Christine, this is Jason Ely from NRTC.
Go ahead, Jason.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I think there's been some really good points raised. And also when you're looking at capacity in these networks, planning for to cover 100% of those service points, including growth. One thing I want to touch on, if you're using a MST out at that end location, there's a few places that you can ensure that you get that growth, and that's planning for the number of spare ports that you may want on an MST. There's also considerations that you need to take in percentage used of the fiber and how much capacity you want to leave in there for the future growth or other things that you're wanting to add in there for public service, those sort of things. And then ensuring that you're also having that growth capacity there in the OLT. And I think there's some really good discussions too. I know a couple of folks touched on leaning towards, sounded like more of a centralized split. So you're adding electronics as you go versus a distributed split where you're paying more upfront for those electronics, a little more investment in the electronics. But the other thing to consider too is in that distributed split world, Your fiber sizing is a lot less because it's only taken one fiber to get out to that neighborhood. So you will see some reductions in the cost of the fiber, as well as in the splicing. So there is some initial increase on those electronics, but there is also some savings in that type of architecture as well.
Yeah, thank you. Other comments?
Christine, this is David. Just a short comment. What Jason just said may or may not be the same design choice that our engineers would make. And I'm not capable right now of knowing whether it is yes or no.
Yeah, certainly.
I don't see any other questions or comments at this time. You can certainly submit way more detailed information via writing as well.
Okay, moving to the next bullet. Really only 2 points on that one is, keep some ports available for future growth. I think that might be a statement of the obvious, but certainly I don't want to assume that. And then, this has been an issue that's come up in a number of places throughout the country. It's around, and the recommendation is that you terminate your fiber inside the building. Now, I know that, especially the CUDs who might be in infancy might say, well, we're better off to terminate the fiber outside the building because then we don't have to go inside the building to serve the modems. But the problem is, you've got to, first of all, these NEMA 4 enclosures aren't exactly perfect so that you expose them to weather. Secondly, you've got to run power outside the building. You got to drill multiple holes and get power outside the building. The recommendation is you terminate the fiber inside the building. Any comments on those 2 points?
This is Carol Monroe. I guess I'm a little bit confused as to when you use the word terminate the fiber. Often when you do a drop from the pole to the house, you terminate the fiber on the outside, leaving a fiber loop in a network cabinet on the outside of the building. And then you bring in only the necessary fiber strands or Ethernet, in some cases, into the building to connect to the ONT. And in some cases, you are required to put that optical network terminal on the outside of the building when there are security systems that require connections, among other things, and multi-tenant in some cases. So there are reasons to do both. I don't understand why we would want to recommend one way or the other in a sort of a general document.
Other thoughts on that?
Are you referring to ONT placement or?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Chris Recchia. I think so. I interpreted this. I wasn't even thinking of the house end or the building end. I was thinking of the hub and enclosures and thought, okay, those don't always. They need to be inside a cabinet, but they don't necessarily need to be inside a building. But now that I hear where you guys are going, that you were actually talking about the indoor versus outdoor ONT, obviously, I agree with Carol, not only because she's my board chair, but because she's right. There are different options that sometimes need to occur. And sometimes people have a preference in terms of how to set up their internal network such that the outside ONT makes the most sense. So it's been very reliable, and it also enables us to fix things without having to go into a customer's home. So that has had an advantage for us. So I think as a general recommendation, you could go either way or both, but I wouldn't want to see it be a requirement.
Other thoughts?
From a customer premise equipment side, I would agree that I think the option is fine like that from a head-end termination or a POP. I don't know if the economics would allow for every single location to be within inside of a building. They may have to use like an OTE style cabinet, which would be a steel cabinet, not just a NEMA 4 rated.
Who was speaking? Thank you. Please just say who you are each time before you speak so we make sure we can follow up as necessary.
Sure. That was Zach with Matrix.
Thank you, Zach.
Thanks, Zach. Other thoughts on that? Okay, based on what I hear, I'm gonna strike that. Anybody opposed to me striking that as a, there's not even, it sounds like there's not even a recommendation there.
If you could mute yourself, Zach, and I think Leslie Nolte might have a question. She has her hand up.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand why the need to get down to this level of detail.
Well, we don't need to. I mean, the point is, I'm putting all these up here. I'm perfectly happy to strike them if people think they need to be stricken. But these are, these are things that come up. You've got to understand, Leslie, not every CUD has the experience. So this is a discussion around the CUDs to understand, at least when they're working with their designers, to understand some of the questions that are going to be coming up. And certainly, I'm no hesitation in striking these, but I think they're worthy of discussion.
I also just want to make clear that these are going to be attached to the construction funding, which we are very well aware of isn't only open to the CUDs. Any other comments on this issue?
This is Tom Cecile from Ballynet. We have certainly had situations where 4 spare ports weren't enough. And I'm wondering again about the specificity there. It very much depends on what part of town you're in and how much growth there is in a specific area. Some of the extra ports will never be used, but even in rural roads, we've seen, leaving 4 ports wasn't enough to prevent needing to do a cutover.
So do you have a recommendation there?
My recommendation might be to be a little bit more general, is keeping, something along the lines of 20 to 30% of the ports available for future growth, depending on area. I just wouldn't be as specific as 4.
Thank you.
This is David. Rob, and Christine, can I ask the question, what is the link between the statewide fiber plan and the criteria by which proposals for construction funding will be judged? Are you saying that that a statewide fiber plan needs to be developed and approved before any construction funds are allocated?
No, we're not. What we're talking about here, David, is in lieu of a statewide fiber plan. I'm trying to satisfy the critics who say, and some of those critics are on our board. So I think the critics are, I'm not questioning why that criticism is there, but the point being, that we need to establish some basic standards that the designs that you will pass along to your design partners, and some of them are on the phone. And I want to make sure they're reasonable, but yet at the same time meet the desire, that the reason for that statewide design to exist in the first place. When we were talking about a statewide design, we were actually talking about every CUD and every road and span. And I'd like to make that, to satisfy the goal, but not necessarily hold up the construction.
Well, the scope of a statewide design does not have to go to the premise. The scope of a statewide design could be, for example, a means of ensuring that all CUDs can connect with each other. Perhaps there is a statewide a middle mile infrastructure that's built to if that's economic. The scope of a statewide plan can be anything you want it to be.
Well, I'm telling you that there are more than a few that want it to be right down to the premise, and I'm trying to head that off.
May I speak? This is Leslie.
Sorry, Leslie.
Thank you. My concern is that these kinds of specifications can't really address the enormous variability in density. You cannot assume that a dead end is necessarily less dense than a secondary run, just for example. And it's so enormous, even within a single town, that kind of variability. I think another way to consider at least is just to say to a CUD, when you submit your request for funding, please answer the following questions. How does your design accommodate 100% access to service? Rather than telling people in advance how to do it, maybe just ask them to respond to that kind of question. This is so rigid that, from our experience, it won't work.
Yeah, Leslie, my intent is not to be rigid, and I agree with you. That's actually a good proposal, but I want to make sure we include enough specificity into what we're asking for, so that, I don't want to surprise people then and reject their proposal because our board just, said, well, you didn't think about this. Let's think about all the things that should be addressed in a design, and I think your approach is a great one. But they need to be addressed. Each design needs to address these items. Certainly, I'm not trying to specify things here, trying to have a discussion to know what are the minimums. So, for example, when we get into this next bullet, we will have to specify some minimums on this next one, because it won't satisfy the board or the state if we do not. Certainly striking fiber terminating to the building, that's an easy one. Keep 4 32 ports available. What I just heard is a recommendation to say 20 to 30%. The question's going to come up, how do you account for future growth in your splitters? And I think certainly it can be asked that way. But I think having a discussion amongst all of us is important, because some of the CUDs don't have the same level of experience. So that this really meant to be more of a discussion, but at the same time, those will need to be addressed as part of the grant requirement. Does that satisfy you, Leslie?
Yeah, I want to see how it finally all sugars out.
Yeah, this is the first time. I want to make sure it sugars out in the best way possible as well. That's why we're doing this.
Yeah, this is a listening session. That's what this is about. It's about gathering feedback on these different ideas, and we'll go from there.
And I do, this is Carol Monroe, and I do think that the CUDs, the comment about the CUDs are not all at the same technical level, that might be true, but each one of the CUDs is partnering with someone, some group, some entity who does have that engineering knowledge to be their voice along that way, and to make sure that when you say design for 120%, they understand what that means without getting into some of this specific details.
Thank you, Carol. That's a wonderful and very important point, that the CUDs aren't going at this alone, as they have expertise that they're depending on for doing this. Other questions? I see Jason has his hand up, and Chris has his hand up. That may be old, though. I'm not 100%.
No, it's new.
Okay.
Go ahead, Chris. I'll wait.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So I'm seeing a theme develop here, and rather than, I definitely appreciate the fact that you guys are saying that this is a listening session, so I don't want to keep beating up on you all, but I see a theme developing whereby I think that where you want to head is when you talk about requirements, I think they should be really focused on how the CUDs all connect to each other, backup requirements, things like that will make it for a more resilient state system. And then I really like Leslie's suggestion about answering the questions that you might have for the other things that are kind of more optional or much more variable. So I'll only say that now once more and get the sense that most people on the phone seem to be agreeing with that concept. And I'll be quiet for a while. But that's my overall theme here, is that I think we should be headed toward how do we integrate with each other consistently and reliably versus this very specific other details. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and I agree. And what we'll still go through these so these questions on these details will be part of the design. So maybe, rephrasing this is how are we going to address these in the design? So for example, you just struck out, well, don't be asking about fiber terminating to the building. That won't be including the design. So we'll strike these as we go through. But certainly these are questions that will come up. You follow? Does that make sense, Chris?
Yeah, that does. Again, I think I really like Leslie's suggestion of asking the questions about the things you want answered to.
Yep, I do too.
Great. Jason, do you have a question?
I do, and it's kind of a comment on the one that says keep 4 of 32 ports available because you're looking for growth inside those splitters. I think, calling that out as 32, you're going to run into some situations in distributed split where you might be utilizing a 1x16 or even a 1x8 to stretch out to further distances. I think it would be a good recommendation to add a percentage of capacity you would like to see versus the raw number of 32.
In fact, I'm going to change that to say, based on this conversation, the question will be, how do you plan to account for future growth at the splitter level? Does that make sense?
It does, and I think that's a great way to word that.
Okay. Based on this feedback, I'll rephrase these questions as we go, where we can. All right, anything else on material usage? Did we miss anything on material usage and installation that we should talk about? Okay, hearing nothing. Okay, now this one's a really important one, because this ties to centralized purchasing. There's certainly been a discussion at the board level as well as the CUD level around, hey, can we purchase inventory ahead of time on some of these critical items? And of course, fiber becomes one of those critical items. So the question is, this is really a question around, what should we agree on in terms of fiber standards? Because, if one CUD's working with, sites are going to run 288 fiber, and they're the only CUD that's running 288 fiber, well, we're probably not going to be stocking that ahead of time. But if we can agree on some standards, then we can do some group purchasing ahead of time. So so here's changing these into questions. Well, first one is a question. How much do we do for primary runs? How much for secondary runs? How much for dead ends? These are not requirements. These are a question. With recommendations accounting for SAG, you folks may have different, the engineering folks may have different, but how do you account for SAG would be the question. How much are you providing for your slack loops? Have you considered the distance of service loops in your design? So the idea being, if you're going to include slack loops at a percentage, and you're going to add the end run to the premise, that adds to your distance. So, what does that do for your light? Anyway, those thoughts on this one.
This is Zach again. I would recommend that this maybe be tabled until there's a more concrete definition of primary and secondary. A particular CUD, a particular community or town may have a different definition of primary run based on the local geographics, when the state may have a priority at a different alignment for that cable. So that may be wise to look at the state as a whole on those major roads and compare that against and almost tell the CUDs what is defined as a primary and what that limit would be recommended at for future allocation at some capacity. As for the SAG and SLAC loop, that would really be determined from a distribution level design on what the plan was for the actual access point material specification. You don't need SLAC loops if you're going to do an area cut in on the fiber access point. If you do an OT or an MST, now you have the availability to actually use that SLAC for restorative purposes. But if not, if you're cutting in every other pole, that SLAC would just be wasted. So it depends on what specific network design you're talking about, whether it's a transmission, distribution, or that feeder network itself.
Thanks. Other thoughts?
We have quite a few hands up. Just go right down the list. Jason, do you have anything more?
I do. I think this one is going to be really tough to define when, because if you're looking at a centralized split scenario versus a distributed split, a 144 may have plenty of fiber in it for a primary run, but in a centralized split, your distribution is going to be under the same sheath, which may very well push that to a 288. And that architecture is really going to play a key role in defining these fiber counts. Generally on a distributed split, you could build the whole entire network with 48, 144, and 288. But when you get into that centralized split world, those runs definitely change and impact the sizing of the fiber. So I think it would be a really tough one to nail down if the type of architecture that's going to be used is open.
Okay, see Kyle and Carol.
Yeah, this is Kyle within RTC. I was going to echo exactly what Jason was just saying. Your distribution architecture really determines the type of fiber that you're going to need to use, the sizing of those fibers. But above and beyond that, talking about the sparing requirements that we've got for everything else, you can easily run into situations where a particular CUD is looking to reserve, 60 fibers for various usages in the future, depending on what their specific priorities are and requirements. So you can immediately start to chew up huge portions of even those primary runs just based on what their individual requirements are. As it pertains to, I think it was Zach that was talking earlier, in regards to the SAG and storage loops, that's going to be determined by, are you using strand and lashing to it? Are you using 6M, 10M, 6.6? Are you using ADSS? What type of jackets are you using for that? What that jacket is rated for, with how much Kevlar is in it. There's a lot of different things that can play into the specifics of what's necessary there. So if we want to standardize across certain materials, then we can certainly start getting into the weeds of those decisions. But you really have to understand the specific priorities there to be able to make really good engineering recommendations on those.
Carol?
I think this is another area that really is going to be very subject to how rural and how dense the areas are in question. If you look at the 23 EC fiber towns, we run a limited amount of 144 strand, and even 72. The bulk of the network is built on 48. And that has to do with how rural the areas are, and the design with the splitter in the field on the strand. And so if it's a different design and a different concept, then those fiber strands would go up. We would probably build a little bit higher level today, but I'm not sure that running 144 everywhere is a economical solution. And so it really has to do with the design. When it comes to purchasing, I think most of the CUDs are almost in that phase of high level design, or in that, or will be shortly. And that, I think, is going to give some pretty definitive numbers on fiber counts. So I don't know that we need to specify this as much as we need to aggregate the demand for the fiber.
Any other comments on this section?
This is Zach again. I have one last comment in regards to the material. You had spoken about a joint initiative for purchasing. I think that would make sense if it aligns with everybody, but maybe getting a joint material allocation or a guaranteed price may be in the best benefit of the CUDs to give them the flexibility in material selection and based on their particular design criteria, but maybe use the state's weight with such a large project to secure a better price for them as a collective.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, just as a suggestion, once we're talking about questions, I think this should go towards the end of how does your fiber sizing or design meet the intent of reaching 100% of existing capacity plus 20%. Then that addresses pretty much everybody's concern where Carol brings up, you need a smaller fiber count for very rural with no expectation of growth to a more, I guess, denser location where you may need a 144. I think that would all come out in that simple question is how does your design meet the capacity requirements of this particular area? Whether it's, the SAG stuff doesn't really come into play in my view. The slack loops really don't come into play because that's all about addressing, the expansion potential, growth potential, as well as the existing capacity.
Thank you. Michael Birnbaum.
I want to agree with Carol. I think that a whole range of fiber counts are going to be needed depending on the areas. And the idea that Christine raised of buying a standard to buy, I think that the CUDs have large enough scale that we don't have to standardize on any particular statewide fiber count, that we can order a variety of counts and store them. The key is just ordering it. It's not so much that it all has to be the same stuff. And the other comment I want to make is on slack loops. Not every design is going to specify fiber access terminals or fiber access points every other pole or at any particular standard. So there's going to be a need for slack loops placed on poles for future installation of possible FAPs or fiber access terminals. Therefore, a standard for slack loops is a useful thing, or at least the question, how are you going to account for growth in areas where there's no construction now? So I guess that's it.
Thank you, Michael. David Jones.
Yeah, building on Carol and Michael's comments, it's not clear to me that there should be a specific specification, but there should be a question that we might answer in our applications. But at the same time, I know DV Fiber would be interested in participating in some joint purchasing exercise on behalf of the CUDs. And we would get our engineering group engaged to specify quantities and reach some agreement on specs and possible vendors. Just sizing it up, has there been discussion of this at the board level? And and let's imagine that the amount of the purchase would be about the same as the amount of the pre-construction funding.
Yeah, well, I'm not prepared actually to bring it to the board until, this discussion is part of that. I don't want to go to the board without, the board's going to ask me questions around how this is going to work. And I don't know the answer to that yet.
Carol, your hand is up. I'm not sure if that's new or old, but do you have an additional comment?
Old.
Okay.
It's old.
Okay. Great discussion. Thank you. Let's move to network design and documentation. So now this future growth. So here's one that's, highly political. I'll throw this out for discussion again. So, the issue is preparing for mobile wireless and how much spare do we include? So I kind of used 144 count as a standard and said, okay, you provide a spare tube for public safety, future growth and wireless. And then of course you would scale that down based on if you're doing a secondary route with 48 fiber, then you cut that 12 down to 4. And if you're doing 24, you cut it down to 2 fiber. But this is the one that really takes a lot of is a target. So what are your thoughts on this one?
David.
Who is the customer and how do we get their requirements?
Customers, I think who's paying for this?
Correct.
Yeah.
Who is our customer? Because if we build capacity, we will be selling it to a customer. Who's the customer and how do we get their requirements?
That's funny. I thought the state was the customer because we're paying for it.
I think this is more about having excess capacity for future needs again.
Yeah.
And to integrate in public safety, mobile wireless, and other items into this design. So we don't want to build twice, what it comes down to.
How do we obtain the requirements for public safety? And
okay, let's hear from others.
if we include those requirements, who will be consuming that capacity? That's we want. If we're going to pursue this, then we would want to get that information.
This isn't about serving a current need. This is about building a 40-year network and making sure we have spare capacity. So that's what this is about. This is not. It's not something you would survey for. This is our best guess.
Okay, thank you, David. Leslie.
Yeah, I think David had an important question because basically you're saying to all participants, spend a fair bit more money on your network design for a future unknown in volume, unknown with respect to who your customer is going to be, and unknown as to timing. And my understanding of the mobile carriers is that they do not like buying from other providers. They want their own carrying capacity. Now, between now and 40 years from now, that whole environment could change. But in terms of what we know now, I don't understand how a CUD could be responsive to this.
Well, we're paying for this, so it's not like you're paying for this. We're paying for this extra capacity. So just let's hear from others on this because this is an important one. This is one we're probably not going to get around.
Sorry, who's paying for it?
Okay, thank you for the comment. As I said, this is listening. We have a lot to figure out. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. So this one struck me for public safety purposes. It seemed to me that we should be able to get some guidance from emergency management, right, about what their needs are and what they envision, such that we'd have that as a kind of guide. But that's how I've been thinking about the public safety piece. And I'm wondering if any conversations have occurred with emergency management and maybe Velco or other utilities about what do you need for public safety? I don't know. That's just a question.
No, we have not had any discussions with anybody, but we certainly is a good suggestion.
Carol, do you have another question?
So I guess on this particular question, are you suggesting 36 strands of fiber be set aside for some unknown need in the future?
Out of 144, yes.
And so it just seems like it seems like an awful lot. And the second piece of it, though, is although you're saying you're paying for it, each one of the CUDs has to have a business plan that's going to support this network, their network, with revenue and with revenue ultimately in the end. And so although you're paying for it in terms of construction, you're really not paying for it in terms of maintenance and the future going forward. That has to come from whatever the business plan deems is reasonable to expect. So as we keep adding on additional costs to the network, it isn't just about putting in the fiber that we don't know what it's going to be used for. Frankly, there's a lot of fiber out there already today on the poles that we don't know, that we can't use because it wasn't deployed in such a way that we could get access to it 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's just not relevant today. So it just seems like we keep adding and adding additional overhead to these networks for something that's come a little bit unknown. In terms of public safety, it's my understanding AT&T has picked up that responsibility, and according to them, they're proceeding and getting the job done. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what we hear. I've not had any mobile wireless request actions to use fiber strands from the CUD. The occasional cell tower comes to mind, but it's an awful lot of overhead for that process.
Thank you. Kevin.
Yeah, hello, thank you. Yep, Kevin Fitzgibbons from NRTC. And I just have one comment and one question. I guess my comment is, like, I think the one comment was that this is really going to drive up the cost of design. I wouldn't anticipate that it would drive up the cost of design so much as what Carol mentioned. It would drive up the cost of, materials and construction and all these kinds of things. But my question, though, is, does the state plan on reviewing a design standard that each CUD is creating and ultimately approving those standards or not? And because it seems to me, for instance, this kind of discussion right now, every partner is going to work with the CUD to try to understand what are their, fiber allocation requirements. And if the state has additional fiber allocation requirements, then it would seem that, I guess the state would need to communicate those requirements to the CUD so they can build that into their design standards. But again, are you anticipating on, so in other words, are you trying to create design standards now, or do you ultimately plan on reviewing and approving design standards?
Well, I think you should know that my position's changed since this hearing. I think I was going into this thinking we would do design standards, but I think what we'll do is review design standards with the idea that these are some of the things that you need to answer. Now, the spares discussion is a little different when it comes to the review, because there may be requirements around spares. I don't know what those requirements are. But that we don't, that may not change from CUD to CUD.
Yeah, I encourage everybody on the phone to look at Act 71 or H360 for the requirements of a construction grant. That's what we're trying to, with having this discussion and discussing different design standards, that's what we're trying to address. To have the conversation. So, Kim Gates. Kim, do you have a comment?
Yes, I do have a comment. I have a couple comments. So this is Kim Gates. I'm with Franklin Telephone. And just listening to this, my recommendation is for people that have never built a network. First of all, my understanding is there's a lot of money to be hired out for the design. So I would assume that competent people would be hired for the design. But I would recommend that the CUDs be in a room to discuss the pros and cons of all these things on your list. And just like phone companies, there's different reasons different decisions are made. And it's helpful to know the options, and it's helpful to know why those options are done. So it's sort of hard when you have these rigid design standards and then you get into the real world and they don't always mesh. The other thing is, I call it the Murphy's Law of fiber, is the customer at the end of the line with no conduit is the one that wants to be connected with the most need. And I don't have the full agenda in front of me, but I don't see anything in the conversation of hitting those unserved customers. I mean, it's great to think of public safety and other people you connect, but I don't see the priority being unserved in this highlight. And then the other thing, just with a little bit of experience, we've had our internet service for 20 years. In 20 years, we're on our third different type of equipment, which means 2 of those equipments we had in service were working, and we've upgraded, pulled all that out and upgraded. So when you start talking of a 40-year plant, understand that technology is changing. You're not going to get a design that's going to last you 40 years. And just on the telephone side, with the telephone switch, in 30 years, I'm on my 4th switch. Doesn't mean you can't, get equipment to last longer, but when you're talking state-of-the-art equipment, it's changing rapidly. And so you need to understand, you may design it for 40 years, but the technology and things change very rapidly. That's it.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I had one question. You probably haven't done this, but you know the mileage or rough mileage of coverage that you're looking to try to address for the underserved and unserved. Have you rolled up what this future sparing may account for out of the money that's going to be available?
No, we have not. Yeah.
Okay, that may be a worthwhile to this discussion too, to help put some boundaries around it. Just having a ballpark idea of, we think 36 is a good number for no other reason, but what does that actually account, what does that actually cost? That may be a good thing to know. I'm not sure there's going to be really any operational expense associated with it, but definitely, material and installation fee. The installation probably won't change though.
Thank you, Jason. Anybody else? Okay, yep. Michael Birnbaum.
I want to say that I think that the proportion that's in this plan is reasonable. The idea of a spare tube for public safety, mobile wireless, and future growth makes sense on 144, and Christine's suggestions for 48 and 24 sound about right too. I want to agree though with Carol and Leslie that the mobile providers don't tend to want to work with CUDs or small private providers. They're very comfortable with their contracts with large providers like First Light or phone companies. And so it remains to be seen whether they would be a future market for CUDs. Future growth, for sure, you want to have extra. For public safety, Velco's on the board. AT&T isn't, so FirstNet needs to be consulted to see how their wireless is backhauled and whether they're needed. And then there's the state entities themselves. I don't know how much is needed, but usually entities like to have a whole tube to themselves, even if they're only going to use 1 or 2 strands. They don't like to share tubes with others just because of vulnerabilities. And that's when it starts to get more problematic in terms of how much fiber you're buying. And the consequence of all of this is that there's a lot of money coming into the state, a lot of grant money, but it's not sufficient to do the whole thing. So this will impact the ultimate long-term budgets, the construction budgets, the splicing budgets. And so it's not just that it's going to affect the operating expenses, it's also going to affect capital expenses for large CUDs. So I think we should be very cautious about expanding these. I agree that there's need, but we should define from public safety what they need and determine whether mobile wireless is going to need any at all. And I guess that's my comment.
Thank you. Any other comments on this topic?
Yeah, just one. This is Jason from NRTC. I think it's great that you put spare capacity in there. You know, the last thing that you're going to want to do is have a network designed that's funded that is 95% full on day one. You know, setting out fiber allocations at the beginning of a design project as you're going through standards is crucial, and setting those for each fiber size is definitely crucial when you're looking at an overall design. The one piece of caution that I would probably add is, you know, there seems to be some concern about mobile wireless, and maybe it's just the buckets and the names of buckets. You know, you might find some of the power companies may want a reserve for AMI and SCADA, or when you look at some of the school systems that you may or may not want to serve through the E-rate program, they're going to need some allocation. So maybe the 3 buckets, the naming or some additional uses could be applied. So there's a little bit of flexibility in there, especially if one CUD doesn't have a need at all for that mobile wireless right now. But I think you never want to build a network that's full capacity on day one. So having those allocations are in there and is wonderful. And then maybe just a little, you know, looking at the definition of what those are actually spared out for.
It's a very good point when it comes to schools and libraries and other potential public customers.
Absolutely. And, you know, public safety doesn't just mean a circuit to the firehouse too. I know there's been some talks and concerns about, you know, maybe there's a connection at the boat launching ramp to where if there was an issue there, people could have some connectivity that might not be there now. So maybe some things like that need to maybe fall into that allocation for the public safety, or, you know, maybe an access point at a park where there isn't any wireless signal in case they had an issue. But just some flexibility in those terms, I think would go a long way.
Thank you. It's very, very flexible. This is really great for us in terms of knowing, like, making our list of who to follow up with as we seek out answers to these questions. So I'm going to go to Scott Brooks first, and then I'll go to David. Scott hasn't spoken yet. So.
Thank you very much. Scott Brooks with TDS Telecom. I kind of want to keep this in perspective and kind of dovetail some of Kim Gates' comments with respect to unserved. That's been our challenge for years in the areas that we serve in Vermont, which is Northfield, Roxbury, Ludlow, Cavendish, Proctorsville, and Perkinsville. And just to give you an idea, we've actually worked with state grant programs in other states, and the one I'm most familiar with is New York State. They had, back in 16, they had a $500 million broadband grant program. We actually were able to, work with the state, take advantage of that. And we, between our dollars and state dollars, we spent $34 million to run 950 miles of fiber past 11,000 households. My understanding here is we have $150 million, possibility of another 100 million next year. So a total of 250 million. And so I just want to kind of keep this in perspective that, we passed by 11,000 households in 3 years, 950 miles. I just want to make sure that we are going to try to get the unserved customers in Vermont first. That's, I'm a Vermonter. I've lived here my whole life, and that's really been my thing. And I know we have gaps in our area, especially let's take Northfield, for example. In downtown Northfield, we can offer 100 meg to our customers, or 15. I know it's not 100, but they do get 100 meg, 50 meg, 25 meg. It's the pockets out in Roxbury, out in the outer parts of Northfield that we struggle financially to try to reach those spots. So I just wanted to kind of give folks an idea that, what we're talking about, how much you can cover with the amount of dollars we have. So just my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. David, do you still have a question, or are you good for now?
I'm good. I think Michael Birnbaum covered the comments. Getting the requirements for these purposes will from some state entity will be helpful in understanding our customer requirements.
Thank you. Any other comments on this section? Okay.
I think this next bullet, power supply backup requirements, I'm going to change that to say that's something that you'll need to address in your design standards. In your design. These are, I got to tell you, this 4-hour backup, that was a national issue at the FCC. The FCC tried specifying 4-hour minimum, and
this is something the E911 board is addressing as well.
Yeah.
So it's something to pay attention to as you design the networks, because we want to make sure that there's a lot of redundancy there and resiliency for making sure 911 calls are connected. It's important to everybody.
So with the statement that one of the items that you'll need to address in your design is power supply and backup. What are your thoughts or comments on this?
I see we have, let's go to Chris first.
Thanks, Rob, Christine. So this is an example of one where I feel like a statewide standard would be helpful, because I think that we should all be assured that our resiliency is consistent. I don't know what the numbers should be, but I think that being able to have backup for internet, if we all, and I think we all on this call think that internet is an essential service, we got to be able to have that. And, for one of us to have 12 hours of backup or unlimited backup because we have generators and propane, which is what we have at our hubs, and for others to have a 2-hour or 3-hour or 4-hour, wouldn't make sense. Maybe 4 hours is the right number, but we should have, I think, some consistent guidance from the state as to what we should be designing for on that front.
Thank you. Michael Birnbaum.
Along with a bunch of other people on this call, I participated in a PUC process looking at backup power for fiber, particularly in relation to voice. And so we're talking about two things. We're talking about the backup power at the hubs, which should be really long and should be required. And then there's the backup.
Are you still there, Michael? Okay, I think we lost Michael.
I think I got I think his point's well taken, that the backup power at the hubs should be longer than the field cabinets. So, and of course we'll do a lot more research, but definitely keep going with the comments.
Carol,
Backup power, certainly at the hubs and the central offices, I think needs to be pretty defined. And long-term generators, for the most part, would be helpful, although most of those hub cabinets can get about 8 hours of battery within them. So that's something to consider. And I think that the FCC requirements for voice are pretty clear in terms of voice over IP and what is required to supply to the homeowner when you deploy a voice over IP system, what's required and what's required for you to so what's suggested, I guess, would be if a customer asks for a longer amount of time. And so I don't think the state needs to define that. I think that's pretty well defined already from a residential perspective for voice. For internet access at the residence, that's I think that gets really complicated based on what you use your internet for, how often you use it, and whether
Can't
you're
really
using it for something
hear you
critical
for this.
or not.
okay,
That's it.
thank you, Carol. Anybody else? And if you're not talking, please mute yourself. Are you back, Michael?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I wish I was on fiber here. I don't know what the last thing you heard was, but my final point was that I think the providers should offer 12 and 24-hour backup for end users, but it doesn't mean that the providers need to pay for that. That could really drive up the costs, and I think that they should be obligated to have equipment available, and that the end users who want 24-hour backup can buy it, and that would save on the CUD budget, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee Cheney.
Hi, this is Lee Cheney from Waitsfield. Like Carol stated, most of the providers today that are providing service and partnering with the CUDs, we've got experience on all this of, letting our customers know what's available as far as batteries at the home. And we all provide today minimum UPSs and backups at our cabinets and at our host offices at minimum of 8 hours. So this is something that we're doing today. It certainly could be noted and people could have a standard to it. But at home, there's websites where or offerings from the telcos to allow customers to purchase batteries, or if they have voice, we choose to give them a battery for backup. And if they want a longer sustained power backup, they have the option to purchase that. So, we do have that kind of standard thing today. And that was all from FCC. So just wanted to put that in there.
Thank you. It's as with all of these things, these are things we want you to be thinking about. And some of you may have addressed it, some of you may have not, but it's going to be something that'll be looked at in your proposals. Any other questions related to this topic? Please raise your hand or speak up. Okay.
Hey,
thank you.
Next one gets to the GIS formats and availability. Comments on this one?
Christine, this is David. Grantee must provide all design mapping deliverables to whom?
To the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
For what purpose? Will the VCBB examine all details of every design?
No, we want to have a centralized database.
Why?
Well, in case the CUD fails, for example, in case somebody gets hit by a beer truck.
Well, if a CUD fails, the design isn't going anywhere. The CUD will be in contract with a with an operator or some other set of vendors, and those contractual relationships will surely include ownership by the CUD of the network design and as-built. So there
I
will
think
be.
it's important to note that this is just trying to have a single standard that everything needs to be in GIS format, that this isn't, that we don't want things on paper.
Yeah, this wasn't really meant to, I think it's, anyway, what other comments do we have? I didn't really want to sit here and defend all these. I just wanted to hear
We're
your
just putting
comments.
together information
Yeah.
as one. Carol, do you have another comment on this?
Just that I guess that I would want you to consider how you think that the VCBB will use this information, how much of it will be public, and how much of it, and who's going to update it on a regular basis, because it's one thing to have a design, a detailed construction design, high-level design, then a detailed construction design, and then real-time, as-built, and then when it changes tomorrow and you have to provide it again, how is that all going to work? That's a lot of work, unless you're planning on hiring 2 or 3 full-time GIS staff.
Other thoughts?
Thank you. Lee, do you still have your hand up, or is that old?
That's old.
Okay.
Yes. We've come across some local municipal utilities that have no poll data in electronic format or whatever. They haven't mapped their polls in, 30, 40 years. Who's going to pay for the cost of mapping those polls?
Well, to answer that, if it's in a CUD territory, the pre-construction grants can pay for that cost. It can also be included if necessary as part of a construction project for other eligible entities. Steve Huffaker. Steve, unmute yourself. Okay, we can come back to Steve. Michael Lasser.
I'm here. How about now?
Okay, let's go now, Steve.
I'm sorry about that. So I want to just add to Carol's comment regarding the public nature of these records. We need to bear in mind that this is a network security information. This is subject to potential problems related to sabotage. So we need to be very mindful of what information is available and how it's accessed to ensure that we have a secure network.
Okay, Michael.
We also have the practical consideration of multiple CUDs and private providers using different GIS systems, even if they all use GIS, and even if a majority of them are Esri based, they aren't going to necessarily be mergeable. I see this as potentially unuseful and a burden for all the submitters. I think requiring a useful GIS system for the design so that it can be accessed in the case of bankruptcy or whatever is useful. But I think maintaining it and updating it and coordinating all the separate design systems that will be used is going to be difficult, and requiring all of the providers and CUDs to use the same system is probably untenable.
Thank you. Michael Bierbaum. That was Mike.
That was me.
Mike Lassie first.
Yep.
So I think we.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mike Lucy. I agree with what 3 previous commenters all talked about. I do agree with that, but I just want to bring out the practicality of real-time red lines, aside from the point that Carol brought up about keeping it updated, as opposed to, real-time as-built. I mean, that's really a duplicity in a lot of extra work. This will definitely if it's even practical to get your contractors to do this, which I highly question, it's definitely an added cost and an added time requirement to manage all of this. So, I mean, if the state is going to take the high level design up front for their evaluation, that I first of all, I think that's enough. And when the CUD or whoever has the grant says that they've built it per the spec, that should be sufficient. But if there is another step that's necessary, it would only be the as-built if in fact the security issue is addressed. Getting the red lines, the typical process, right? This comes from your GC, marked up, then it goes to your engineer, which then finally develops an as-built, which is actually an electronic version of the change from the original design. That's basically what those two things are. So it's, once again, using a word that Mike brought up, burn bomb, that's a bit untenable, I think, as well. I'm not sure it's going to be useful, but more of a resource issue.
Thank you. Any other questions and comments? Okay, moving on. I guess this is the same.
Sorry. Either this is Kevin. I apologize. I put my hand up maybe too late.
All right, Kevin, go ahead.
I apologize for that. I just think that ultimately we need to, again, sort of understand, what the state wants. I mean, if the state has requirements where things need to be, available to be exported in GIS, if the state wants, things to be updated in a timely manner, if they want, to be able to, if they need to, for one reason or another, access, a designed or as-built network and get an accurate representation of that, that's going to be a lot of work, regardless if it's electronic or paper. And I understand and appreciate everyone's comments, but I do think there's some efficiencies that can be created with what you've suggested here as well.
Thank you. One question to everybody. The state has been trying to use the E911 database and that's what we use to determine if an address is served or unserved and in all of our mapping. Is that something we can have consensus on right now? That all addresses that are submitted for projects will have the E911 addresses? Because we're talking about time and work and money here, and I've been involved in trying to match those addresses, and I know that has been an issue in previous programs and taken days and slowed things down. Is using the E911 database for addresses something we can all agree on? Anybody have lots of comments?
Rob, I've got to tell you that we have found that your database to be quite flawed. And it may be just the nature of these databases. You've got some barns in there and, and then your flags that determine whether an address is served or unserved, oftentimes we found they make no sense. You'll have two addresses that are 3 or 4 locations apart on a road, in which the further one is served and the nearer one is unserved, and it makes no sense. So it may be inherent in the system. I think if your board doesn't understand that, they need to. But no matter what you do here, you're going to have issues.
Yeah, I think I'm more asking on the other side of when you submit data to us. Well, we can certainly debate the accuracy and the problems with broadband availability data. We know it's best in the nation, but we know there are inherent challenges with that. That's just how it goes.
In fact, I would add that you just described the problem entirely right. The problem is we have static databases, and these are why this discussion is important in terms of, how static are we going to leave our databases? If we're going to update them every year, they're not going to be accurate. Of course, the ideal is to have them updated in real time, which, we got the technology and it's possible, but the discussion we're having here really describes the problem very well, right? There's, I know that in the utility world, You know, the advanced utilities were doing pretty much close to real-time updates of their databases because there were safety issues. Do we need to do that here? I don't know. You know, but that really gets to the issue. You know, if that E911 database is only going to be updated every 2 years, it's not going to be accurate. If it's updated every 24 hours, it's going to be accurate. That becomes the real issue.
Karen. Okay, maybe Kevin's hands up. Michael Beerbaum.
All the databases are flawed. I think Vermont's E911 database is better than the others, and therefore I agree that it would be probably the best standard, at least for now. FCC's database is way worse. So I support the suggestion of using Vermont's E911 database as a standard, even though it has the flaws that have already been discussed. The one thing I want to make sure we do is correlate that with utility pole locations, because there are a lot of locations in the E911 base that I don't believe CUDs intend to serve because they're, well, you know, thousands of feet off grid. So that's the only comment I have about that.
Thank you. That's a good one. David.
Okay, thank you, Rob. We agree that the base of the E911 data, as far as we can tell, is perfectly usable. And the distinctions that the database draws between various building types, I think, helps us to differentiate between the sites that we would aim to serve and those that we would not, just as the department has extracted a portion of those total E911 locations in its statistics. I don't think there's any question we would use that as the basis for the design. Was there some discussion here of perhaps of some requirement that the CUDs provide data down to the E911 level to the board for some purpose? And if so, what is that purpose?
Well, I think the purpose is if we are submitting a construction grant application, when we ask you for the list of addresses, we want them to already be E911 addresses. They need to match with the database.
Yeah, and of course we want to be able to confirm, confirm connections and speeds as well. You know, that's actually part of the ongoing data reporting, which.
Yeah. There's going to be two questions. One is the total count of locations. It seems to me those might be evaluated without having to present, every location data point. Whether or not the locations are served as in the DPS data is another question. I know of at least 500 in our service area that we don't think are accurate.
Well, that is a case you will likely have to make in your application. I think the Public Service Department data is what is going to be the standard with new data ideally coming out. I think the plan is for next month.
Yes,
that was a board discussion in the last meeting.
So,
we will address
Tom.
Hi, yeah, Tom Cicero from ValleyNet. A couple of things. We have been using the E911 data effectively in the EC fiber area. It does change. We have to do, our contractors and engineers have to do updates on that consistently in order to make that available. But, we certainly are comfortable with that. I would add some clarification to one of the comments earlier about the types of properties. I think I'm in full agreement that we don't need to worry about graveyards, but barns, on the other hand, that's one of the reasons why we sometimes have to have more connections available than you might otherwise think, because people want to wire their barns and other outbuildings So those are valid spots that we need to make sure that we're taking care of. And then I do have a comment about the rest of the slide, but I think we're still talking about the.
We can move to the other part of the slide. Looking, I don't see any other questions. Any more comments specific on the
Good.
911?
So as a 40-year software engineer, I can't look at the words real time and then have it defined differently. It's either real time or it's 48 hours, because someone will forget your definition about 5 minutes after you put it out if you keep saying real time. And I guarantee we will not be able to do real time updates.
Yeah, well, good point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or comments on anything else on the slide that's currently on the screen?
This is Kevin. Can I just make one additional
Sure.
comment about the conversation that's been going on? And I apologize, I forget the gentleman that shared it, but I think one of the comments was too that this would add expense at the contractor level, this kind of requirement. And, full disclosure, just, the way we do design, like we would be able to meet this, the GIS requirement and electronic format requirement. And so we have experience for sure working with a number of contractors on this kind of design or similar, maybe not the exact, but similar. And there are certainly some that resist it for sure. And then there are some that know they need to sort of evolve and get there. And then there's some that are there. I guess the comment I would make is, and I know labor is really going to be a challenge, and getting contractors and getting the everything that you want to accomplish in the state is going to be a challenge. That said, you're about to spend a whole lot of money and build a whole lot of fiber, and I think that if there's ever a time for the group to sort of make some requirements from contractors, this would be the time to do that. And certainly, again, it's not easy, and we've had some contractors that we have to ultimately come up with a workaround for, but that always is because the end customer usually is okay making those accommodations or just wants to maintain, a certain, maybe the project isn't big enough. But I just wanted to add the comment that I understand the comment that it could add cost from a contractor perspective, but I also think the state's about ready to spend a lot of money, and that there might be some requirements that contractors have to meet that maybe they're not used to meeting.
Yeah, actually, thank you. I'll leverage that to put my personal bias in here. In year 2003, I eliminated paper maps at Vermont Electric Cooperative. The line workers grumbled for about 2 years, but afterwards they were like, "Thank God we've got this." In 2007, installed a field management system and required that with our contractors. Several years of complaints, but later on the system proved to be very valuable. It's at some point, you got to ask the question, why aren't contractors using field management software? Because I've also I've run into the problem personally where people hadn't properly documented the tubes and the fibers, what fibers were connected to what fibers on what tubes. Run into lots of problems that field management software took care of. I'm not saying that that's my personal bias is going to set the standard, but I do think Kevin brought up an interest. What kind of drives my question when I get into this world to say, why can't we have field management software? Work management, field management. The reason people have made those investments is because they increase productivity and reduce they reduce quality problems. Hang on, I lost Rob, the control person, so I want to see if there are any comments. I'm going to run to the control here. I can figure out. Oh yeah, a couple of hands up. Okay, Tom, go ahead. Tom Cecere, ValleyNet, your hands up?
Sorry, I should have taken it down.
Okay, Leslie, you've got your hand up?
Yes. I think probably we can all agree that would be wonderful if all our contractors had field management, project management software. However, we know that right now there's a fairly significant labor shortage in terms of construction labor and contractors. What happens when we impose this requirement? It just squeezes that shortage down even more and or opens the door to large out-of-state contractors replacing local folks. So is there going to be a training program, a funding program for Vermont local contractors to get up to snuff? What's going to be the way that we're, the unforeseen perhaps consequences of making this a hard requirement?
Any other comments? Okay. Oh, Jason.
Yep, just a couple things there. So, to echo what Christine had said, when we transitioned from using the paper maps to the field maps, there was a little resistance. And what we found is, at the very beginning of projects, we make the requirement known in the RFP. And we've not really seen any contractors at all that push back too much on the purchase of a few iPads for their crews. Generally, the training is setting down in a day or two because the attributes are the same. It's just a little bit of navigation. And then I noticed a comment that popped up about cellular connections. The way a lot of these platforms work, and the one that we personally use, is you have the ability to download those maps in the morning and work offline during the day, and then any changes that occur throughout the day, there's an upload and a refresh done every single night. So working out in areas without cellular connection is not an issue at all. It's just a matter of having that connection in the morning or every other day to do those refreshes and updates in there. But I know it seems like a big change. I've been doing this for 26 years. I was a little resistant to that change, but it's actually extremely valuable, a very easy transition to make. And with the technology of being able to work offline, it's a whole lot more flawless than what you would think as you move into that change.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments on this slide that is up right now?
Yes.
Go ahead, David.
Okay. We don't think it would be desirable to assign a splitter port to every premises unless the premises are active. Why would we need to do that?
Where are you, David? We're talking on the documentation and changes. If it's something we've already gone on, please submit it in writing.
Wait. Did we actually talked about this page already? Did I miss something? About
I think you're on the wrong page.
Are you on the documentation and changes?
Yes.
Okay.
The first bullet.
Oh, okay.
Where are you?
No, you are correct. I apologize.
Okay. So.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I was in the wrong place too. Thanks, David. I didn't have that slide up. Yes, I get your point. We kind of hit this. Yep, that ties the first slide. I got
right.
it.
So go ahead.
Why would we include a detailed optical? I think this is in the slide. Let's see. Why would we include detailed optical measured loss dB calculations in a design? The loss is captured when the OTDR is performed after construction, and all optics are built within a certain distance to the premises, which assures the premises will have signal strength within the optical budget. So why is this necessary?
Well, it's pretty simple. It's plan versus actual. That's going to give you a lot of information. By the way, that's just available as part of the design software. So yeah, that I would call that good design and good operation practice. You want to know what your projected loss is going to be based on your design software, and then your measured loss, and that's going to tell you, you know, if you've made any mistakes in terms of your construction. And of course, you might have some bad splices there too that will show up as a result of this.
Well, that comes out later when doing the acceptance testing of the construction. The design itself should include an optical budget, and it should be transparent. You know.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Any other comments on this slide? The slide that's on the screen right now.
Yes, Tom Cecere again. I'm not sure I understand the fourth bullet point, the last bullet point. Estimated measured loss, is it an estimated loss or a measured loss? And this changes over time. You get a storm or degradation. Are we going to keep updating that every time we get a change? And how do we measure that?
No, I'm sorry, estimated should not be there.
Okay.
Okay, Kyle?
Yeah, Kyle Hubbard, NRTC. So to address two things, on the first bullet point in regards to assigning specific pond ports at the OLT for a splitter, again, that's sort of distribution architecturally dependent. If you are using and understanding that there's different ways that you can define centralized versus distributed split, right? Some people would say that a true centralized split means all of your splits are happening at the OLT and everything running out from there, versus a more hub and spoke type architecture where you're running everything to an FDH cabinet or a splitter cabinet, however you determine your verbiage there. If you're running things in that format, you absolutely wouldn't want to pre-assign a pond port to an individual splitter module that would then be assigned to an individual demand point. However, in a fully distributed split, meaning you're not bringing everything to the specific cabinet, you need that specificity to say if splitter A needs to be turned up, then pond port 1 is assigned to that splitter, and keeping those records intact. So that way, and if you're going to do pre-assignment on everything on day 1 to avoid, as many truck rolls in the future, there, again, it's all a matter of mixing and matching priorities based on the CUD's specific, requirements and what their desires are. Sometimes you'll be involved in engagement where they want to make upfront costs as minimal as they possibly can, knowing that means they're going to have more operational expenses, and some people take the opposite view. They want to go ahead and spend it all up front, minimize their operational issues in the future. So it comes down to how you balance those different priorities. So if you're looking to minimize your ongoing expenses, you would want to pre-assign those in a fully distributed format where each individual splitter is already traced back. And then as far as I would echo the same thing on the measured loss, the estimated losses that are provided there. It does give you the benchmark. If I say that, my design out to, a particular point in the network should be coming in at a neg 18 dB, and the actual measured loss comes in at, a neg 19 dB, that immediately tells me that there's an issue somewhere in the network. And I can't remember who it was that mentioned it before, but making sure that you're taking into account things that not just will it work, but will it last? As that glass degrades, as you start to see additional loss introduced in the network, so that you can handle fluctuations in the glass in storms and wind and ice loading, and there's all those different considerations that need to be taken in. So that's a part of just truly engineering that particular circuit, so that you can understand, will it actually hold up if everything is being done according to that plan? So,
thank you, Kyle. Next up, Zachary.
Thank you.
Zachary, okay.
I have a comment on both the loss budget and the asset management from the third bullet point here. For the third bullet point, I'd like to maybe request clarification as to how you're looking for the assets and what the purpose of that function is really to benefit. Is that for mutual assistance between CUDs? Is there that ability for one CUD to request materials if there's an emergency, or how does that get evaluated? But with some of that material, is there going to be a standard assigned of acceptable material? I think the ARPA requirements with domestic, et cetera, and banned nations is an easy item to cover, but is there going to be additional criteria on that front that needs to be maintained? As for the loss calculations, is that going to be, so typically that was already echoed here. The loss calculation is part of that design criteria based on the exact architecture of that particular setup amongst that area that it's being built out in. Now, when you construct that construction documentation package, that becomes part of that bid package for the contractor to execute and be gauged against and measured against. If you were at a .05 for a splice or a .5 for a connector, and the actuals came back lower, or excuse me, higher, worse, that's a contractor issue. They'll have to go out and do reburns, recertification testing to meet that spec, so there'd be less risk. So if that could be expanded upon about what that measured loss is aimed at, I think that would be beneficial. There's going to be a significant difference. Obviously, there's a threshold for what service is being delivered based on the ONT specification, OLT specification, distance, split, et cetera. But if you're looking at just the glass to ensure it's up correctly and installed to industry standards, there's a few different ways that could be interpreted. And I think it might be valuable to define exactly what the state would be looking for from that front, so that you get an apples to apples across all those deliverables.
Thank you. Yeah. Let me just address the RUS code stuff, because that, your point's well taken on the loss factor. The intent of this this corresponding RUS codes is really to make it, is really both for centralized purchasing as well as being able to CUDs to share material. So that was the goal of the RUS codes.
David, do you have something quick? Okay, David is not there. Any other comments on the slide?
Oh, sorry, Rob, I was on mute. Is there an assumption that the CUDs will not be purchasing their own materials?
Well, no, there was a request from the CUDs that we look at centralized purchasing. But that's, understand, RUS codes, I'm used to the utility business where we, where, for example, if we were short a transformer, we could, call other utilities. If you have a transformer, you don't have it in stock, you can call other utilities. And the RUS codes made it easy to be able to get material when you were short or didn't stock it or underserved. So the RUS. But as far as, yes, there has been requests around centralized purchasing, and of course, agreeing on the material, that kind of ties with our earlier discussion. Not sure how that's going to work if we don't agree on the material.
Okay, that's true, but that doesn't mean that we have to use RUS codes. Our partner says that federal methodology is not universally adopted and is cumbersome. So why would there be a particular reason to use that?
Okay, other comments?
Michael Lassie.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I was going to talk about the RUS codes because not everybody may want to utilize the centralized. So it is a very cumbersome process as well. So I would say it ought to be optional if folks intend to avail themselves of some centralized purchasing practice. If not, then they can go their own way.
Any other comments? Okay, any other comments on this slide as a whole, or can I go to the next one? Okay, last slide. Christine.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so the first bullet really ties with the fact that, you know, we are going to look at a statewide ring and working with other states and maybe even, you know, for geographic redundancy. So, you know, we're going to certainly look for the CUDs to make sure they identify the integration locations with the other CUDs, as well as with the statewide network. And, you know, so part of your design is a proposed integration point.
Comments? There's David and Zachary both already had their hand up. I don't know if it's new or old.
Well, I have a question. What is an integration location?
That's where you're going to tie in with another network.
Do you mean tie in to a backhaul connection to a wholesaler?
Backhaul collection for wholesaler, a connection for points of redundancy. You know, think of you know, the ring. Think of the ring topology with a statewide ring with sub rings that cross CUD networks.
Well, if we know where the ring is going to be, then we could perhaps specify a location where we would connect.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's we won't know until you design the ring.
Yeah, you're also going to integrate with other CUDs, so you'll need to work with the other CUDs on those integration points.
This is Zach again. Is the state going to provide guidance or standards to follow as far as what the acceptable networking criteria are for those integrations? I'm interpreting this redundancy as between CUD number 1, 2, and 3. If they have multiple POPs between them, that each CUD will have redundancy amongst their own POPs and then connect between those CUDs over either the state rings or that redundancy. But when you come into that, there's networking provisions that would need to be made and criteria met. So if you have a certain speed and availability on your backhaul from CUD 1, and it's sharing that load with CUD number 2, and CUD number 2 loses its self-procured backhaul, what is that minimum requirement for CUD number 1 to support the load of CUD number 2? And that's going to require a lot of coordination and network sharing, which could introduce not necessarily vulnerabilities, but there should be some sort of guidance as to what that looks like. And if CUD number 1 needs X amount of bandwidth for their oversubscription rate to provide service to their subscribers, what is that requirement from the state to oversubscribe that further for that scenario where they might be carrying that load and on some sort of service level agreement to carry that until a restoration effort is on the neighboring CUD can come back online.
Thank you. Great point. Chris Lynch.
Yeah, Chris Lynch, Matrix Design Group. Just 2 quick points. One, and this is kind of on the second bullet point, current or past performance references. The CUDs don't have any networks built, so it'd be kind of difficult to reference any experience with that. And the second thing is geographically, there's a number of places in Vermont where redundancy itself is going to be a challenge. I'm thinking, you know, as an example, Islamont has a single bridge connecting it to Alberg, and that's it. There's no redundant path. So it might be good to be more general and say, what is the redundancy plan? You know, instead of saying, well, what's the 3, you know, plans that you have? Just
and to respond to the one thing about the CUDs that have not built it yet, we're talking CUDs in conjunction with their partners who are experienced and who are building these networks, just to be clear on that.
Thank you.
But thank you for that feedback. Jeremy, do you still have a question? You lit up on my screen, but
Yeah, Chris kind of answered it. I was just hoping to just understand more what that second bullet was really driving at.
Okay. Any other comments on this slide? Okay.
All right, thanks, everybody. That was great. So next steps, this is going to be an iterative process. So what I'll do is I'll kind of rewrite these things with all the suggestions, get it out to you all for input. And then, I think, well, we'll do this, in writing. And then, I think we can come back with one final session because I think, you can come up with some really good suggestions. I was thinking this might take multiple sessions, but I'm being optimistic here. I think you gave some really good suggestions, and thank you for that.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Any final comments?
Yeah, final comments? Leslie.
I think somehow this was raised earlier in the conversation, but I'd just like to flag it again. And that's the question of security and confidentiality for all this data that the state is going to be collecting. I think that needs to be addressed from the state's point of view to those of us who may be required to submit information. Would like
I've got that. I took that note. That's definitely
been
heard, and I agree with your concern.
Kim Gates.
Yeah, and I just want to circle back with, I think you need to do more to address the unserved, because I don't see anything in these conversations pointing out the unserved.
Yeah, no, agree. I think that's a given for any and all of this $150 million in funds. That is the goal, is to bring everybody who's unserved or underserved into the modern age. That's what it comes down to.
And Kim, I'll try to capture that more in the next iteration. I'm not sure how, but I definitely heard you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing with this whole design thing is there are existing providers that would make more sense to hit those unserved little roads than to go down, main roads to hit them. That should be a very valid option to pursue.
Certainly. Michael.
Yeah, just one comment on just the kind of the absolute nature of the way this reads to me is that, not all the unserved or underserved are in CUD networks. So the mandate to integrate, or the implied mandate to integrate may not be practical or warranted. So I just, if you can take that into consideration, that'd be great.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And we ended in time for lunch. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Good job, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your comments. This will help us figure out the next steps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait, what?